With the end of the Nintendo eShop and Nintendo discontinuing the 3DS line of game consoles, I thought it was time to share one of my old projects. A 3DS with every USDS game on it that I bought and modded a few years ago. In commemoration of Nintendo ending the production of the 3DS, I bought this special edition new 3DS with intent to mod it as far as I can, because if I'm going to mod something, I'm going to do it in style. Not only did I put every USDS game on it, but I decided to take this one step further. Now, I modded this new 3DS and did the regular stuff. Got a 512GB micro SD card, added homebrew channel, FBI installer, and Twilight menu. The main event that will unlock all of this gaming history that Nintendo, and basically every other game publisher, doesn't seem to care about anymore. I got lucky and was able to use the sound hack on this 3DS, which is just me playing a sound file on a 3DS to get homebrew channel installed. The methods of jailbreaking are always changing, so I won't be going into doing these here. As usual, I'm going to focus on experience. Twilight menu is an all-in-one solution for emulation and storing DS games on one device. Twilight menu is a bit of a resource hog, but it gets the job done. As a redundancy, I also have a few standalone emulators. I like to use Twilight menu DSi theme because it's reminiscent of the DS Lite menus. It even plays some nice music of your choice as background music. Though I forgot to put it here because someone changed it the last time they used it. Again, it's a bit of a resource hog, so you can change it to a menu that matches up to the old R4 cards if you are more into an efficient interface, but I like the aesthetic of it. It makes a modded DS feel like something you could hand to a child, or like something Nintendo might make if they ever release something like this. A DS Classic maybe? Whatever the handle equivalent of the NES and SNES Classic would be. Now this is where you get the first problems with putting this many games on one device, and that's managing the library. The new 3DS is a fairly limited device even considering the year it came out. It was clocked to 804 MHz, not even 1 GHz, and only had 256 MB of RAM. For perspective, many phones at the time were dual core and clocked at 1 GHz per core and had 1 GB of RAM. The menus, regardless of how you set them up, seem to miss games sometimes and is capped at 325 games per folder. There isn't a search function for just finding the games you want to play. Nintendo really didn't think that anyone would ever put this much software on one device. You can get around this by just making several folders labeled 1 through 9 and A through Z, which let the 3DS handle it better and organize them accordingly. I believe this is a limitation of the software, only being able to show 25 games at a time per scrolling. Once you hit that, you need to go to the next page. Twilight menu can also pull artwork off the internet, though the 3DS can't really handle this in a timely manner when dealing with such a massive library, taking 20 plus hours to load all the artwork onto this device via Wi-Fi. Thankfully, there's a desktop app that can do this far more quickly for such a library. Just take out your SD card and put it on the PC. Then direct where the artwork is saved on the SD card. Once you placed all the games in the right folders, all the DS games will play as though you are running them natively on an original DS or DSi. Now, from what I understand, the reason this works so well is because the new 3DS has hardware in it going all the way back to the original DS. It's just been overclocked. All that homebrew is doing is unlocking the DS in DSi mode. This is similar to the Wii because the hardware was essentially an overclocked GameCube with some new hardware integrated into it. This method of running DS games also removes region lock, so Japanese versions of or European versions of games are fully playable if you are playing on an American DS. Twilight menu has an added benefit of being able to emulate other consoles besides Nintendo's. So that's what I did. Unlocking DS mode incidentally also unlocks the Game Boy backwards compatibility of the console. So I put all the Nintendo handheld games before the Switch, the entire Game Boy line from Game Boy to Game Boy Advance, from all regions on this device. I went even further and put several non-Nintendo consoles from before the N64 on this, which sounds wild, but these games took up less than a megabyte in many cases. I added Sega Genesis, X32, ColecoVision, and Atari 2600. NES and SNES games as well were added to this, using the same folder structure as I did to the DS, as I did for the DS games. I added in several standalone emulators, MGBA, SNES 9X, and RetroArch. RetroArch is very temperamental to use. This is like taking all those mini consoles everyone was making a few years ago and putting them all on a much better form factor. It destroys the library of those devices, beating the NES Classic library by 300 times just based on the NES library by itself, and pretty much beating every one of those mini consoles by the same amount. Yes, they all do run well, almost as though they are built for this. It's amazing how far technology has gone in 30 years. Will I ever play every single one of these games? Probably not, but I wanted to see the limits of this device. Like many, I watch gaming videos where people discuss old games, and I absolutely love watching someone like Scott the Woz or Metal Jesus discuss Call of Duty games on the DS or The World Ends With You, and being able to pick up the 3DS and check it out for myself without having to go online to search for it and wait for it to be shipped. It makes experiencing gaming so much more convenient, easy, and accessible to me. I'd like to think I'd get through all these games to varying degrees over the course of my life, provided I can find a replacement battery for this thing after it stops holding a charge in the next decade. Why didn't I install every 3DS game on this? Well, yes, you can install games directly to the 3DS home screen. You can use FBI to install a CIA file, haha, doesn't the homebrew community have a sense of humor? Or utilize God Mode 9 to rip cartridges off of an actual game card. There's a problem. It's kind of impossible with the current firmware and hardware. Space-wise, it's viable, assuming you have a big enough SD card, since you could put all the DS and 3DS games on a 512GB SD card, and if you mostly stick to one region. The 3DS home screen is capped at 300 icons, not games, just icons, which means you start to max out limits of the 3DS at around 250 games after you take into account basic apps and homebrew software that needs to be present on a 3DS in order for the game installations to work. I believe you can bypass this while using the FBI launcher, which should show all the games on the 3DS, be it one more than the limit or 1,000, but it's not exactly the most appealing method of using a 3DS. I like opening it up and seeing all the games on the front screen. You can use something called 3DS Bank to essentially create two home screens, but that creates about a 30-second load between the pages. So under project, right? Nope. You can bet this didn't stop me from taking this project further. As you can see on the main 3DS screen, that it's got plenty of 3DS and new 3DS games on it. Since I have this hard cap and couldn't just throw as many games as I wanted on it, I decided to set a criteria for what to install. I decided to set the following criteria: handheld exclusives, new 3DS exclusives, technically impressive, novel, and stuff I like. Exclusives are anything that didn't release on anything other than maybe a PS Vita or PSP. Why waste space on a lot of multi-platform games that are available on PC, like most of the LEGO games? On a side note, I'm surprised at the number of games that were released on 3DS that also have Xbox 360 or PS3 versions that just look like low-res versions of the game when on the 3DS, like Ben 10 Galactic Racing or Sonic Lost World. Then I focused on new 3DS exclusives like Xenoblade Chronicles, impressive ports like Luigi's Mansion, Captain Tilt Treasure Tracker, Spider-Man The Age of Time, novel stuff like adult-rated games like The Binding of Isaac, because man, that's not something I would have ever expected to see on a Nintendo handheld that was heavily aimed at small children, and of course stuff that I just personally like. Much like the Twilight menu, using FBI to install games bypasses the region lock, so you can play games like the Japanese exclusive My Hero Academia fighting game, assuming you can read Japanese or make heads or tails of what's going on via context. I also added PS1 games that people have figured out how to port over to the 3DS in the form of bin files that have been converted to CIA files. They run surprisingly well too. The 3DS treats it like it's a virtual console game, even prompting the bottom screen like it's a normal virtual console game. It's so odd to have Spyro and Pepsi Man playing on the 3DS natively. It's such a convenient way to install it too, since the less game savvy amongst us wouldn't be aware that these games came from a PS1. You could potentially convert every PS1 game to work on the new 3DS XL, but of course take into account space limits. You could also do a similar CI injection method with GBA and Game Boy games on PC too, but I would only do that with something I consider my favorites from the Game Boy line. You can kind of get PS1 games working via RetroArch on the 3DS, but like I said before, it's temperamental, but if you're concerned about hitting the 3DS game cap, this is one way to bypass it. RetroArch is just nice to have in case the standalone emulators don't behave well with certain games, and it reduces the total number of 3DS icons, allowing for more games. I don't even think this version of RetroArch has been updated in years. All in all, it's a little over 200 3DS games installed to the main screen, about 20 apps, and about 30 or so homebrew apps. Of course, this DS also has other novel software on it, that I didn't cover here. All the standard DS homebrew apps are on here, like Homebrew Channel, Godmo 9, Animon Theme Manager with every official 3DS theme on it, and even a 3D movie player, and a few 3D movies that were officially released on a 3DS, but I like focusing on the games when I'm using it. At the end of the day, the thing the 3DS does best is play games. I have about 15 other convenient devices I could use for playing 3D movies should I want to gouge my eyes out, though there is a novelty in seeing what the tech of the time was able to do. I even have more extreme emulators like the N64 emulator installed, but that runs like absolute garbage for now, so I wouldn't recommend anyone try this. It's just too much of a chore to get things running right, and if you try to run it with the 3D on, you aren't ever going to get a good experience. Perhaps someone will get this emulator running at full speed via code optimizing or something. Now for a few downsides. Load times can be long. Twilight menu can sometimes take upwards of 2 minutes to load, and sometimes you have to click on the home button and then return back to the menu to get it to work. Even booting the DS up can take a while, sometimes taking a minute to load from being completely off. Oftentimes, it won't load a theme even if it's installed. I think it's an issue with 3DS read speeds. Load times increase every 32 gigabytes of storage that get used. The only real workaround is keeping the DS on in sleep mode most of the time. You also have to deal with periodic crashes, Retroarch being one of the biggest causes of this when being used. This can even happen when you're exiting games in the Twilight menu. Trying to do too much too fast will also cause crashes, like trying to launch a game while another is running. Besides those two things, it runs everything I've shown here really well. Now some of you might say, don't you love emulation? Why are you doing this? Well, I have always hated DS emulation. DS emulation in particular looks really bad to me on almost anything other than original hardware. Because it's two screens, one that's roughly 16 by 9 and one that's roughly 4 by 3, there really isn't anything that matches it unless you are using a tablet, but then you are losing portability and require external controllers. You run into problems with fitting everything on the screen and making it look good. Putting both screens next to each other always feels so wrong to me. A Galaxy Fold is a good alternative, but very expensive, so unless someone makes a DS replica with two screens, emulating it will always be kind of weird. Maybe some brilliant mind will make a 3DS-like device that's an FPGA console, but then pricing of the device is going to be a nightmare. While I wouldn't recommend getting this solely for emulating things like PS1 games or even N64 because it isn't exactly the most optimal way to play those particular games, it's definitely worth modding one to relive that DS and 3DS nostalgia and even playing the Game Boy line, along with added benefit of playing anything before the PS1 and 64 era games without any issues. The convenience and ease of play for DS games cannot be understated. If you're going to limit your library due to load times, then go with 3DS, DS, and Game Boy games. The 3DS is a special device because it's one of the few consoles that could hold its entire game library on one device. In my mind, there are only a handful of game consoles that could do this. The new 3DS, the PS3 with every PS1 and PS2 game on it, PS Vita with every PSP game, and the Wii U, which could hold every game from the Wii U back to the original NES. Though why anyone would want a complete Wii collection is not something I'm sure about, considering the amount of shovelware on it, but to each his own. These consoles are special just because of this archival property, making them cool to have for collectors and space savers for those who love gaming but space is at a premium for them and they love the console form factor. One thing I like about this modded device is the stories it tells and the kind of people who would mod it. I can picture a child who loves games having this be the only device they have to play games with and just modding and pushing it to an extreme so they can experience the history of their favorite medium. A game developer for the DS using it to learn how to best design for the DS. Someone who is into vintage video games but doesn't have the space to put all these games on a shelf. A game collector who grew up on the 3DS and wants to relive their childhood. Until someone figures out a better way to emulate the DS library, I'm going to enjoy my modded 3DS.